good evening, and thank you all so much for joining us. It's my pleasure to introduce Adam Stern. Adam Stern is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School and the director of psychiatry at BIDMC's Berenson Allen Center for Non-Invasive Brain Stimulation. Adam attended Brown University, SUNY Upstate Medical University, and the Harvard Longwood Psychiatry Residency Program. Adam's published writings spans from his academic work to creative nonfiction and fiction as well. Among many other outlets, his essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe magazine, and the New England Journal of Medicine. He was featured on the cover of the Boston Globe for his extensive writing as a psychiatrist who has now become a patient living with cancer. And he has appeared on CNN as a psychiatrist expert during the COVID-19 pandemic. Adam also chronicles his observations about psychiatry, medicine, and life in general through his cartoon series, Shrunk MD. And his memoir from HarperCollins, Committed, is available in all formats wherever books are sold. I actually listened to the book on Audible, and really neat fact, Adam himself is the narrator, which was really cool. And let me tell you just a little bit about Committed. I'm going to sort of whet your appetite here. So Adam Stern was a student at a state medical school before being selected to train as a psychiatry resident at one of the most prestigious programs in the country. His new and initially intimidating classmates were high achievers from the Ivy Leagues and other elite universities around the nation. Faculty raved about the group as though the residency program had won the lottery, nicknaming them the Golden Class, but would Adam ever prove that he belonged? And I'll skip a few lines here, but in his memoir, Adam pulls back the curtain on the intense and emotionally challenging lessons he and his fellow doctors learned while studying the human condition and ultimately the value of connection. Most important, as they study how to help distressed patients in search of a better life, they discover the meaning of failure and the preciousness of success. Adam's growth as a doctor and as a man has readers rooting for him and his patients, ultimately finding their own hearts fuller for having taken the journey with him. So all 60 of us or so, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Adam for joining us here tonight. Thanks so much for being here, Adam.
Hey, thank you so much. Let me start by thanking you, Robert, for helping to organize this. Let me thank all of the partnering libraries, Wellesley Books, everybody who's put this thing together. And let me thank everybody who's attending. It never ceases to amaze me that how much interest this book garners, and I just appreciate everybody's attention and enthusiasm for the topic. So I'm really looking forward to talking with you.
Wonderful. Chan in the chat says, I read your book in one weekend. I loved it and I couldn't put it down. So let's jump right into the questions after I gave a big spiel here. Adam, and I'm sure you get this question every time you do an interview, but why did you want to become a doctor? And why did you choose the field of psychiatry and say not cardiology?
Yeah, thanks. Those are two distinct questions for me, but they end up tied together. So, as anyone who has read the book knows, and anyone who knows me personally knows, my father's a cardiologist. My brother and I sort of went through medical school in parallel, and he's a cardiologist. There have been doctors in the family for a long time. So I always grew up sort of respecting the profession as an honorable way to make a living and do good in the world while providing for yourself and your family. I simultaneously, I also really always found psychology really fascinating. So going back to high school, I was doing social sciences research, and my favorite class was probably AP psychology in high school. I majored in psychology in college because I enjoyed it while doing the pre-med classes, thinking, well, I'm going to be a real doctor someday, but let me major in psychology. It wasn't until I was about halfway into medical school, starting my clinical rotations, that I looked back on a lot of our didactic work and some of the early clinical work, and realized that the thing that I found most interesting during medical school remained the brain and behavior and the characters, the people that were behind what might be a diagnosis on paper, there are real stories and real people behind those, two-liners that you get about the patient before they walk in the door. So that aspect of medicine of psychiatry within the broader realm of medicine, I thought to myself, if I'm going to really do this for a long time, I better choose a path that I'll be good at, hopefully, I'll be inspired to do, and that will let me keep some of the creative elements of my mind open and always eager to listen to people's stories and tell stories and try to make sense of things like that. It's a great question, though. Thank you.
Yeah, and sort of as a follow-up, can you speak to the process of how you became a psychiatrist, and specifically with your residency program? You described it as exhausting, isolating, and lonely. Can you maybe touch on that as well?
Yeah, this is something that I think is pretty ubiquitous across all of medical training. So I'll say that, for anyone in the audience, either in medical training, with a history in medical training, relatives who are going to be doctors or within the medical field, there's a lot of intense work that goes into becoming a doctor. And so in medical school, you're paying for your education, but in residency, you're working for your education. And so the way you get paid a bit, but you also spend up to 80 hours a week in the hospital, working overnights, taking on a tremendous amount of responsibility. For me, I went straight through. So I was sort of like graduated from high school and then went to college, and graduated from college and went straight to medical school and then went straight to residency. So when I started residency, I was in my mid 20s. And when I think back to that time in my life, and I think to how much responsibility was suddenly, sort of bestowed upon me overnight in the middle of a locked psychiatry unit, it's sort of overwhelming to think about. And I also think about a lot of my friends who took other paths, went to college, lived life for a few years in the big city, had jobs, had different responsibilities, versus someone like myself who went straight through with education for years and years on end. I think the difference is that to some extent, the path that I took can lead someone to feeling almost like, okay, I've been in school, I've been studying for how many years, and now I'm 26 years old, but I'm like in charge of a lot of very important things, people's health, people's psychological health care. And so, it can be a kind of grueling, intense experience. And then on top of all of that, you're paired up with a cohort, right? So for me, there were 15 of us in our group, in our class, and we spent these 4 years all together. And essentially, why I bring that up is that it reminds me, if in my college there was something like 1,400 kids in the class, and then in med school it was down to about 150, which reminded me more of like junior high and high school. And then when you get to residency, it's almost back to like nursery school where like pre-K, where you're all in the class together all the time. So, and you rely on each other and you get to know each other really well, no matter if you get along with the person or not, or if you fall in love with the person or not, and so all of those things can be sort of different paths by which people can arrive at all of these very intense emotions.
And we'll touch on love a little bit later on. I'm glad your
Okay.
memoir had some love in it, though. That was good. So a question I'm sure, again, you get all the time, but can you talk briefly about the imposter syndrome? So what is this? And, why were you constantly doubting that you weren't good enough to be in the program? And, even you sort of explain the imposter syndrome at the end of the book, but throughout the book, it's constant. And even when you get the highest scores of the entire program, you're still later doubting yourself. Can you talk about imposter syndrome and why you had those doubts?
Yeah. As a brief preamble to imposter syndrome, let me say that the more experience I've had, and I've been out in as an attending in practice for, I guess, 8 full years now. So if you include residency, it's about 12 years since medical school finished. And so the longer I get into the field, the longer I've been in the field, I should say, the more confident I am that that you should be suspicious of people who think they know everything, right? So there's a certain humility that comes with experience because medical care, healthcare, mental health care, it all is humbling. It never ceases to challenge you. And so I've grown more comfortable with being uncertain. Uncertainty is something that you can identify and embrace, and it can actually help make you a better doctor when you're able to tolerate that uncertainty. Now, what's imposter syndrome and where does it come from? This is another topic that I think is frankly ubiquitous across all of healthcare training, and frankly most academia. So in most fields, I think that a lot of people get into it and wonder, is this right? Have I earned my spot in this program, whatever it may be? Imposter syndrome, if I were going to define it, is a sense that at any given moment you might be found out that you're not good enough to be where you are, and so you can have almost negative fantasies about being sort of called into the program director's office and them saying, "Oh, sorry, it turns out there was a mistake and you weren't matched at Harvard after all. You didn't match anywhere. It turns out you're not good enough to be a doctor." That kind of negative fantasy can happen. I think that's true a lot in medical training because traditionally in medical training, and I include psychiatric training within that, there is a see one, do one, teach one model, by which I mean you observe a little bit, I should say. You observe a little bit, then you are performing and doing the job while being observed, supervised, and then you're finally teaching others to do what you've learned to do, which is where I am now in my career, while still being a lifelong learner, ideally. So because that's the model of how we learn experientially. So in other words, in med school, you study, you learn the foreign language of medicine, you understand how the biology of the human body works to the ability that we can, but you don't know how to practice the art of medicine until you actually do it. And so because that's the model of how we learn to be doctors, it leads people to question whether they're in the right place, whether they've earned their spot, because by definition, we come in not knowing what we're supposed to learn, right? And so because of that, it's only natural that over time you end up having to, again, grow comfortable not knowing and just having the expectation that if I do what people have done before me, if I put my heart into it and work hard and keep my eyes and ears open to lessons, then I will achieve the goal that I'm striving for.
So another theme of your book is the importance of human connection. And so can you speak to the importance of a doctor making a genuine human connection with their patients? And a lot of great quotes throughout the book. I'm going to dumb down one that I think you said. It was something to the effect of, some patients need medicine, some need surgery or whatever, and some just need someone to talk to. So can you talk about the importance of that human connection between the doctor and the patient?
Yeah, so I think that at its core and from its very foundation, psychiatry is a field that is defined by human connection. I think that being able to understand another person's inner world and their experience in life is all about forming that connection. It's about empathy in the literal sense. It's about really, as I was writing the book, I realized I was writing the word empathic as opposed to empathetic. And I said, why am I doing that? They're both legitimate words as far as I can understand. Why is it that in my training, the word empathic has come up over and over and over again, but no one ever says empathetic? And to the best of my investigative abilities, what I came up with from researching it a bit is that empathetic is an adjective describing something, an interaction, for example, whereas empathic is referring to the person being an empath. It's referring to the person connecting to another person at that underlying level. And so that's the core of psychiatry, is having that foundational ability to actually connect with someone and not worry about what's most important to you, the doctor, but first worry about what's most important to the patient. So if you're able to make that connection, then you can actually work together in a therapeutic alliance. And there's another component to the sort of mini quote that you read, which is being in it with a patient. In psychiatry, we'll sometimes refer to holding emotions with the patient, being in a holding environment for their emotional experience. That's a very powerful thing that is hard to articulate. It's hard to explain why that is so useful. But when people are going through the worst times of their lives, when they're in emotional turmoil, when they don't know what to do and what's going to come next, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is just be present and try to understand what their experience is, and let them describe, or even if not describe, sort of just connect with you over that experience that they're having. And so I think that those are powerful lessons that are hard to teach in a sort of like med school curriculum. But again, once you go through the training, it becomes very obvious.
So how difficult was it to manage your own mental health during your residency? And can you, you had a colleague who unfortunately took her own life. And can you speak to how initially you felt a stigma around psychiatrists seeking out therapy?
Yeah, so psychiatry, I'll push back a little bit on that question just because I think that there was a time decades ago where part of psychiatric training was mandatory psychoanalysis, right? And that was when psychoanalysis was very much in vogue, and it was very much part of being a psychiatrist. The field has transitioned a lot in recent decades, some in some ways for the better, and in some ways not for the better. But that culture of destigmatization of receiving therapy yourself, the way psychiatrists, at least good ones, will look at it is that having insight to your experience, having insight to the biases that we all bring into every session, having insights to the relationships in your life that challenge you and might represent barriers to you giving objective advice. Those are all ways that therapy may actually help a psychiatrist be a better psychiatrist. In addition, it's a little bit like that analogy when you're on an airplane and they say that should the oxygen masks come down, secure your mask first before you help anyone next to you. And the reason is that you need to be in a place of good mental health, essentially, to be able to put your stressors, your everyday stressors, your challenges, leave them at the door when you're with patients and really focus on what the patient needs you to focus on.
So you have the ability to kind of leave your home drama at home. But what I'm wondering is, the follow-up question to that is, can you leave your work drama at work, if you will? So next question is,
Right.
Are you able to sort of compartmentalize,
Yeah.
your work? There's a scene where you have trouble sleeping. This is early on. And so you go into work. And then there's a scene where you come home from a difficult day at work, and then you go to your patient portal and you check on a patient, and the patient had passed away. So I'm just curious, can you talk about the difficulty of being able to sort of decompartmentalize, hopefully I'm using that word correct, your work from your work and your home life from your home life?
Right. I think that compartmentalization is almost an essential skill that medical trainees across the board have to master. It's probably more prevalent in certain fields than others, but in psychiatry, where part of the job description is that people are going to come to you in their darkest hours, they're going to come to you when they are with their biggest problems that they're feeling unable to manage on their own. There has to be an ability to some degree leave that. It's not that you forget about it, but it's that you're able to be mindful of your surroundings and the people that you're with when you're not at work. And that's essential. How do you achieve that? It's a little bit of practice and a little bit of redirection when you notice that you're failing at it. The book describes, as you mentioned, a couple of instances where it didn't come naturally to be able to not think about or not worry about the patient that I'd seen just the night before or the day before. And that's still an issue. I still to this day will be worrying about patients that I saw yesterday or 6 months ago or 10 years ago. I mean, that really happens still. And I bet if you asked, if you surveyed 100 doctors, you'd get about 95 or so saying the same thing, that there's certain interactions that still, I don't want to say haunt them, but certain patient outcomes, certain situations that they'll think about that they'll never forget. I mean, that's probably the best way to frame it. And so that's certainly the case for me. Now, what I owe to, my children, my wife, my family, my friends is to be able to just sort of put it on pause for periods of time, right? And what I owe to my patients is to do the same thing in reverse. So to be able to largely put on pause, my child just switched classrooms in the preschool. Is he doing okay? That was my anxiety recently, and it, is hanging with me every day. Being able to put that on pause and not let that distract me from, or even sort of like change the direction of my responses to a patient, that kind of thing.
So good segue, actually. Who is Rachel? And how difficult is it for medical professionals to attain their professional goals while living some semblance of a normal, balanced life with time for relationships with family and friends?
Yeah, so Rachel is the pseudonym for my wife. Now, I'm going to say something I don't think I've ever said publicly, which is that I feel terrible because I didn't research this before I decided on Rachel as her pseudonym. So when I asked my wife, I talked with my wife before writing this book, and we were on board together, but we would do it semi-anonymously in the sense that, she has her own career, and she didn't want at that time her patients coming in having read the book and having preconceived notions about her, etc. So I think she came up with three names that could be used, and I chose Rachel. And it turned out actually she didn't. That was like her least favorite of the three, but oh well. I didn't do the proper thing, which was to just Google Rachel Stern, MD, and make sure there's not a real Rachel. And of course there is. And I've never met Rachel Stern, MD. I'm so sorry for her that I've written written this character into perpetuity, that Google searches will if you start out a Google search, it'll sort of give you the predictive text of what it thinks you're going to ask. And so if you type in Adam Stern, one of the very first top things is wife or Rachel. And so it's certain readers out there, I think, are trying to maybe figure out who's the actual person behind the pseudonym. So anyway, I apologize to Rachel Stern, MD. I wish you all the best. And that's not who Rachel is. Rachel is a real person in my life whose name I won't say during this podcast, Zoom session.
Yeah, and then can you talk about, though, and you can go, in as in depth as you want, but can you talk about how difficult it is to maintain a relationship while being a resident, while med school into residency,
Mm-hmm.
into a practice. I know the book. It was kind of framed. You kind of framed it. And again, maybe you'll push back on me on this, but you framed it as it was her decision whether or not to go to UCLA or stay with you. But you kind of had a decision too, because if she went to UCLA, you could have followed her, right? So, but anyway, can you talk about having to sometimes sacrifice your professional goals in order to maintain relationships?
Yeah, so relationships in residency are really challenging because, like we've talked about, you're at work a lot with the same people a lot. You have a certain professional responsibility that is immense in a way that people outside of medicine can't necessarily appreciate because they're not in it, right? And so, especially when you're a resident and you're going to be working 8 to 6 for a week, but then you're going to be working 6 to 8 for overnight for 2 weeks, and then that's your life, and you have no say in it whatsoever. And when I think when it was either my niece or my nephew was born, I was like, I got to get down there. This is such a wonderful thing I have to meet my niece or nephew. And no, like there was no coverage. They basically said like, sorry, you have to work here. And then it was only my chief, this isn't in the book, I don't think, my chief resident at the time, who's a wonderful person and psychiatrist named Brandon Gimbel, covered a shift for me so I could do it basically and get down to meet my new niece. Um, so the the bottom line is that you're stuck in the hospital. You're developmentally stunted because you haven't had a social life outside of school basically for 10 years, or most of your adult life, all of your adult life. And you also, other people who are not in that existence, may not want to date someone who is, and so it can be really challenging. There are benefits to either side, sort of coupling up within someone within the field has its merits, and certainly its drawbacks, and vice versa. Interesting. And to your point, just to respond very quickly to your point that should Rachel have matched in California, it's not a foregone conclusion what would have happened. We never had that shared decision making process. But what we were very sure of was that I wanted her rank list to be her own decision. I didn't want to be in a position where she might resent me for choosing a program that she didn't want to be at, and the same would have been true, in my opinion, had she matched in California.
Yeah, I think my favorite scene from the entire book is your proposal scene. All right. And I liked that. And then I think my favorite character, aside from yourself, would probably have been Rachel. But if not Rachel, I did want to get this in here. Um, I'm forgetting his name. He's my favorite character. I forget his name. But the scammer, the slick, what was his name?
Yes, Slippery Nick.
Slippery Nick, and I'm sure that
Yeah.
might be a pseudonym, but is Slippery Nick still around?
I haven't seen him lately. Yeah, no, it's been years and years and years, and I think we just had those three sort of like interactions.
Yeah.
And so I wish him well. I hope he's doing okay.
There we go. So towards
But
the end of the
just
book,
for people who haven't read the book, I just want to say this is an individual. When I literally, for the very first time, am arriving at the medical center to meet my classmates, basically scammed me out of $20, and then quickly, like I was informed, like, oh, that's just this person who sort of hangs around, and don't give him $20 if you don't want to be scammed, in the future. And I would see him at the end of a call shift at 6 in the morning or what have you. So it's an interesting dynamic when you work at the same place for a long time, and when that place is a very, very booming, busy medical center with lots of all kinds of different sort of housing all around it, you end up meeting all kinds of interesting people.
So not only do you survive the residency program, but you thrive. You score high on the exam. You receive awards. They ultimately create a position for you. And so I guess so we wind up going in two directions. You want to teach, which is interesting, and you want to explore more about brain stimulation.
Yeah.
And that's as far as I'm going to go with that. You'll have to explain that to us. But so can you talk about why you wanted to go into teaching and why you wanted to explore brain stimulation?
Yeah. So on the teaching front, it's I should say that to whatever degree I inherited a proclivity for science and biology on my father's side, on my mother's side, my mother was a teacher, and on my mother's side, I also have an uncle who's a professor of literature, and there's a lot. A person is. This is understatement of the century, but person is a complicated thing, and so there were parts of me. I wouldn't have written this book had it not been for so many of the traits that I inherited from my mother's side, and Although now that I think about it, there are a couple of authors on my father's side too. Um, so anyway, I guess I've lost my train of thought now that now
That's
that I
okay.
went.
So why do you want to go into teaching, I guess?
Why teaching? Thank you. So teaching was another, it's just another branch of human connection, the same way that was the thing that I found most appealing about the patient-doctor relationship, rather than deciding on fluoxetine versus sertraline as an antidepressant. The thing that I care more about is, connecting with the person. It's the same thing. Like I can impart psychopharmacologic wisdom as I did when I led that course for 8 years or whatever, however many years it was. But actually being able to connect with students as they're learning is much more rewarding at the visceral level, at the emotional level for me. And so that's why I wanted to teach. And these days, I find didactic teaching less inspiring and less interesting, but experiential teaching. So having residents and med students come and visit me where I practice and showing them the ropes a little bit is a really something I still find really enjoyable. And on the biological side, in other words, the focus of my career, as you said, is brain stimulation, non-invasive brain stimulation. So these are treatment options for people who have not responded well to standard treatments like medications and therapy. And one of the things that initially brought me to that field, that I initially felt drawn to it, was this idea that, oh, it's such a biological intervention that I can't even mess it up by saying the wrong thing or looking at someone with the wrong expression. It was still that imposter syndrome when I first did my first elective at the brain stimulation center. It was that idea. What I've come to learn in my experience is that the human connection is as important or more important, especially in a patient population that involves patients who are really not doing well and have tried, and that the system has failed them so far, in various ways. So connection remains, essential even in a very biological intervention.
Great. So folks, we are at a little over the halfway point. If you have any questions for Adam, start getting them into the Q&A. I have a couple of more book-related questions for Adam. Then I have a few non-book related questions, and then we'll get to audience questions. So feel free to start entering those into the chat or into the Q&A. So Adam, in case we didn't cover something that you wanted to touch on, let me ask you this. What is one or two of the lessons you learned as a resident? So something maybe we haven't touched on yet that you wanted to make sure we included in tonight's presentation?
Yeah, so one thing that I learned that is a difficult concept to accept is that sometimes negative outcomes happen and no mistakes were made, right? And so this is a theme throughout the book, that there is tragedy in life, there is illness, there are things that are out of our control. And I'm the kind of person that looks back on when bad things happen and think, what could I have done differently? What should I have done differently? And so that's been something I've actually actively had to fight against and learn to accept that sometimes, and frankly, it's inevitable for everyone that we'll go through challenges and that we'll go through obstacles and that bad things will happen, and sometimes we can overcome those challenges, and sometimes we can't. And so that's one lesson.
And so big picture, why did you want to write this book? Why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, I'll answer that one in a sort of backwards manner, because the truth is that I've wanted to write a book for a big publisher for a long time, because I love writing and I love the idea of a lot of people reading it. It's why when I do events like this, I love seeing that you said there were like 60 people on, and there are another 60 that will get the link tomorrow who are registered, and that idea that all these people are interested in what I have to say, the story that I had to tell, really, it's a certain ego-driven thrill that I get from that. And so I've always wanted to write a book. I've written lots of books actually over the years. This is the first one that a big publisher, put out. So I got in through the back door because several years ago I was diagnosed with a very serious health condition, life-threatening condition, and for the first time in my career, I was both a doctor and a patient, and I started writing about that experience. And some of those essays, those were some of the essays that found their way into those well-read publications like the Times and the New England Journal, etc. And so, because I had that exposure, and then I realized, oh, I can write things, and actually people want to read it, and I started making connections with editors, and just by way of all of those, it was actually after I wrote one of those pieces that the initial agent, literary agent, reached out to me. And, I had been rejected by probably dozens of agents over the course of my life, adult life. But this was an agent reaching out to me, and I'm forever thankful and grateful to her. She said, "Do you want to write a book?" And I said, "Of course," And so, but then it became a question of what book could I write? What book could I write that would be compelling, that no one's written before? And I thought that this book, my goal for this book was to tell the story of how someone becomes a psychiatrist. Take someone who's just graduated from medical school and they don't know psychiatry, but we all have this idea about what is, everyone has a different idea about what a psychiatrist is. But there's a reason that there are so many New Yorker cartoons where someone's on the couch. It's because it's fascinating and strange and interesting. And psychiatrists are weird in general. I'll say that from within the group of us. And so, I can say for sure that's what I thought I could tell this story in a unique way, because I also in real life had the love story that happened with my wife, and we had interpersonal drama happen within the class. And if I tell it in my writing style, I don't know how to write in a very literary way, so I write in a very colloquial way, and I was able to do it in the first person because it's a memoir about my story. And all of those things added up, I think, and hope, to a story that was accessible to anyone, but especially poignant for anyone who's ever wondered, like, how does someone even become a psychiatrist? What is the deal with mental health care? For anyone interested in those topics, this is the book for them.
And do you have any advice? Well, let me ask you this. What was the reaction? Did any of your 15 fellow residents, any of the teachers and doctors involved with the program, have they read the book? What did they think of the book?
Yeah, so before I wrote the book, so it was after I knew I wanted to write it, but before I wrote it, I got permission, not like legal. There was no like contract signed or anything, but I got permission in writing, frankly, from all of my classmates that remain with us from across the country. Did you let them choose their name, Adam, like you did your wife? Yeah, so I let the individuals who are just really representing themselves, I did let them choose their name, but there are a few characters that are amalgams because we had 15 people in the class. That's too many characters. Right. So there are a couple of characters within the book who represent composites, and for them, I just sort of chose their names for them. But so and then within the department, where frankly I still work, I ask the people in the department who I care most about, who I respect most. I want to write this story. I want to do it in a respectful way. Is it okay? And they've read the book, they've lauded it, they've sent me congratulatory emails, and really I think that they're very happy for the book. And the way that has paid off in really like concrete terms is that I was told at some point during this interview season, this most recent year, that one of the applicants said that they loved our program because they had just read the book and they were really excited to see the program. And so to me, there's like nothing better than that. That's for me like as good as it gets.
Very cool. Very cool. I'm going to ask you a few non-book related questions. I wanted you to be able to plug a few things, and then we're going to jump back to the audience questions. And there's some really good ones, like some questions that are way better than mine. Man, you guys have some good questions. So continue to get your audience questions in. First of all, I recently learned that you're a bit of a cartoonist. Can you tell us about Shrunk MD?
Yeah, so one of the things that happened when I got sick in 2018, and just since I bring this topic up, I'll say that I'm doing really well, and I'm thankful and fortunate to be doing as well as I am. But I am dealing with a forever life-threatening illness, and one of the things that that did for me was it taught me that if you enjoy doing something, you should just do it as long as it's not hurting anyone else. Like, do it, take the risk and do it because you want to do it. And I've always had a little bit of a hard time processing the world, and I put a lot of that into my writing. But I found that when my first son was born and I was sort of up at all hours of the night, I found myself doodling these cartoons about some of the absurdities of everyday life and also the absurdities within psychiatry. It's, like I said earlier, a field that really lends itself to that kind of thing. And so I started doing these cartoons, and then at some point I do them on an iPad, and I upgraded my iPad and I downloaded better software, and then I started doing them more because it was like I could actually do. I'm not a great. I'm not a great artist is a huge understatement. I'm a really terrible artist, but I like the ideas that I come up with. And I've been told that the sort of poor drawing skills that I have is actually, for some people, an endearing quality of the cartoons. So I put up a lot of the ones that I like on my website, adamsternmd.com, which has not only that, but all these essays that I've written that have been in all these different places. It also has a link to my podcast, which is something that, again, I never would have done like more than a few years ago because it's out there. It's risky. It's not risky, but it's just you're putting yourself out there. But it sounded like fun. So what we're doing on this podcast, Characters on the Couch, is we take TV shows. We think to ourselves. I co-host it with pop culture enthusiast, media personality Jordana Horn, and we asked the question: well, what if that character had had a really good therapist? How would they have been treated? How would the show have been different? What might have happened? And we've gone through some classic characters, the Don Drapers of the world, and some more recent, Succession, as an example, has a lot of psychopathology to try to dissect. So, anyway, things like that, the cartooning, the podcasting, writing, frankly, freely and openly. Uh, it's just opened all kinds of opportunities, and I love that I feel the freedom to do those things now.
And Adam, the first time I think I saw you was a year or two ago on NBC Boston. And my memory was jogged after visiting your website and seeing the clips again. But so I was wondering, I don't want to go sort of in a downer direction here, but I know that you spoke a bit about psychiatry as it relates to COVID-19 and the negative effects it's having on people's mental health. And just wondering if you could offer one or two pieces of advice to folks who may be struggling. And, I think some folks have fear that we may go into another quarantine down the road. What are some just general helpful tips that people can use who are still struggling with the pandemic?
Yeah, so first, let me just agree with the premise that this pandemic has been really horrible for people's mental health. So people that already had diagnoses of depression, anxiety, have become, their symptoms have often worsened over the last 2 years. People who have never had these conditions are starting to experience them at a higher rate. One thing that hasn't happened yet, and I hope it never happens, is when lockdowns first started, there was a big concern that suicide rates would go up, and we haven't seen that in the data, and that's been really encouraging. So there are, to say that I know or have any confidence in like knowing how to best cope, it would be a fabrication. But what I will say is that we all have different ways of coping that are restorative. We all have ways of living that we feel better about ourselves and our lives after we engage in them. And I think that to the degree that you're able to lean into those, to make changes to your life that align your actions, your life events with the values that you subscribe to, that's the most useful advice that I can give to people. And frankly, with the emergence of virtual visits, it, I think, is a lot hopefully a lot easier to have access to mental health care than it used to be. Still not good. We still have a long way to go. But there are a lot more people who are seeing patients virtually that you can have assessments with if you're struggling. And I would hope everyone who's participating in the event tonight would agree that agree that the stigma should be overcome, and people who need help should reach out for it.
So you are a successful psychiatrist. You are a published author. You've written in the New York Times. You've appeared on CNN as an expert. We're now podcasting. We're now cartooning. So I think what is next for Adam? I got to think the big screen or the silver screen television and the movies. And I guess my question would be, if Committed were to become a movie or a Netflix or Hulu or Amazon Prime series or something,
Yep.
which actor would play Adam Stern? Have you ever thought about this? Who would
Oh,
play you?
I've thought way too much about this. Yeah, no. So one thing that I'm excited about is I am not meeting. I have what they call like a shopping agreement, I think they call it, some sort of Hollywood lingo for basically like the rights of the book are temporarily paired up with a group, and I'm working with this group to try to figure out, can we put a show together, not a recreation of the book, but a show that is on this topic of trainees in mental health care, because it's something that I think you and I agree, it's just not really well represented in the media landscape, and there's so much potential in terms of storytelling. So I hope that a year, 2 years from now, people, maybe 3 years from now, people will see something on their streaming service of choice, and it'll be, based on the book Committed by Adam Stern. But you never know. I've learned one thing on this journey, which is to never say never about the possibilities out there.
Very cool. Very cool. That's great. So we've got about 10 minutes left. We're going to get into audience questions. We're right on time here. Let's see. Let me go to the chat first. Great question from Chan, who asks, what changes would you like to see in medical training for psychiatrists?
Yeah, so the answer to this is a little bit, well, it's got to be controversial because I'm asking for change. You're asking for change, and I'm going to give it to you. So the change that I would advise is that residents need to be treated more like human beings. So thankfully, our program, the one that I'm most familiar with, really, really has a huge focus on making sure that our residents, that their quality of life, that they're, have access to things, help if they need it, et cetera. But I think broadly across the medical landscape, and I know this because I've worked with a lot of residents over the years. It's a recipe. Medical training is a recipe for adjustment disorder, depression, anxiety. It's a recipe for sleep deprivation. The reason it's a recipe is because the things that go along with it are social isolation, sleep deprivation, poor appetite because you're eating whatever you can grab at whatever time you happen to have 10 minutes. These are not circumstances, and circadian rhythm disturbances, so staying up all night for a couple weeks and then staying up all day, and then vice versa. These are a recipe for mental health challenges. So I frankly think that we need broadly across the country and across all of medicine, we need to do better at treating our residents with respect. Frankly, paying them better than, like I said earlier, residents generally are working for their education while being paid what amounts to a fairly low salary, not much above minimum wage if you're working that many hours. And so that varies from city to city and program to program, but it's still the case that residents are underpaid compared to when they graduate, or like in my case, when I started moonlighting, I got my full license in my third year. I wanted to save up for an engagement ring. I started working at night and whenever I could and at outside institutions, and I would be paid a market rate. And I said, I'm doing the same work that I was doing at the medical center, you know? So I think that that's a concrete, and I don't know how controversial it is, but I think residents should be paid more, and we've got to do better about, I don't know the solution, but we got to do better about people coming out of med school with $250,000 of debt.
Yeah, that's
And
something
then
you mentioned in your book. It's a little bit of a
yeah,
thread. You were able to thankfully not have to take loans, but you mentioned how for those that do, there's so much uncertainty as to whether they're going to be matched or even finish the program, and then that just contributes to poor mental health.
yeah.
I'm glad you. Yeah. Any follow up there?
Yeah, my follow-up is thanks again, Dad. If you're still on, I appreciate all that tuition you paid, because it really, so many of my colleagues didn't have that support or opportunities. Not that their parents didn't care about them, but my brother and I are so fortunate to be in that position. A quick, I don't know, shout out to state schools, State University of New York, 4 medical schools, and they were at the time they were like half the cost of a lot of the private schools, and we got that SUNY upstate education got me all the way to Harvard. So I can't say enough about the education I got in Syracuse, which is where SUNY upstate exists.
Rosamond has a fun question. She asks, do you find yourself analyzing your family and friends?
The short answer is no. I mean, not any more than I used to before training, probably. So we all do this to a certain degree, probably. But I'm very seldom on the clock, so to speak, when I'm off the clock. Someone that I used to know, because psychiatrists get asked this question a fair bit, oh, are you going to analyze me if you meet someone for the first time at a dinner party or whatever? And someone I used to know used to say, I don't even know what insurance you have. Of course I'm not going to, why would I want to make this interaction about that when that's my day job, right? So I do as much as I can to avoid that kind of thing. And by the way, when you're a psychiatrist, like me, and you're surrounded by family members and friends who are really smarter than you, and or at least as smart as you, it can go full circle. So that's the other thing. Is psychiatrists should never be throwing stones, in glass houses, so to speak.
Your father says it was our pleasure. There you go. Michelle says, thank you. This was so interesting, so heartwarming that you appreciate your parents, and it was a great book. Speaking of your day job here, you can choose to answer this or not, but an anonymous attendee asks, how does someone choose a psychiatrist? And perhaps the same anonymous attendee asks, are you accepting any new patients? And how can a patient get an appointment with you?
Yes, so thank you so much for asking those, because those are really important questions. Let me start with the second one first. Unfortunately, I only practice right now in a very narrow corner of the field, which is I provide a treatment, one single treatment option called transcranial magnetic stimulation. And by virtue of the treatment program, we are referred in patients by their psychiatrist. So they have to have a psychiatrist and or therapist already in order to get the treatment, because our treatment is time limited, and they have to go out back to sort of the world and have ongoing treatment after that. And so unfortunately, I am not in a position to take new patients. This was something that changed when I got sick in 2018. I scaled back a lot of the sort of clinical practice I was doing and left it to primarily this one particular area where I only get to know people for certain periods of time, and they're not my what we call longitudinal patients over time and years and that kind of thing. How does someone find a psychiatrist? It's tricky with word of mouth, because people don't talk about their therapists and psychiatrists very openly. But if you know that someone has a good recommendation, that's great. The best person to get word of mouth from is either another psychiatrist who might know, oh, this resident graduated 2 years ago, they're still building their practice and they're terrific, so that kind of thing. If you reach out to someone who says, I'm not taking patients, but I know of someone who is, that's a good way to find a psychiatrist. You can also ask your primary care doctor. A lot of the big systems these days, so there are healthcare systems that have multiple institutions within them. A lot of them try to keep their mental health care within the system. So so basically the psychiatric care, in order to see a psychiatrist within the system, you'd have to have the primary care through that system. That's true of where I work, for example, at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. And then the last is there's like a website called psychologytoday.com where you can actually do a search, and you can do it by insurance, and you can do it by kind of therapy, and you can sort of cross validate like what kind of provider you're looking for, and that's sort of a last resort if those first couple of options don't work out.
We'll get you out of here on this question. Do you have any general or practical advice for aspiring writers, particularly someone interested in writing a memoir?
Absolutely. So here's the commentary and the advice. Commentary is that I am no better a writer now than I used to be when I was rejected by a couple dozen literary agents, when I couldn't find a home for the novel that I wrote, 10 years ago, whatever. I really don't think I'm a better writer. I've maybe had more practice, but the talent is the same, right? And I'm not saying that I'm extraordinarily talented. I'm saying I'm not. So my advice is keep writing, write as much as you can. Don't be afraid of rejection. This is the biggest challenge for someone like me, is that you have to have a degree of rhino skin to be a writer, because if you submit to any kind of journal, magazine, publisher, you're going to get rejected. I mean, we submitted this book to 30 different publishing imprints, and the hit rate was not 30. I'll tell you that much. And so you have to have that ability to say, if they're passing on this essay I wrote, this book I wrote, it's not about me as a person or my value. It's just about the book or them, or it's not the right fit. And if you can allow that, if you can prevent that from preventing you from writing and following your passion, and the aspect about memoir is that memoirs are not the story of your life. They're not your autobiography. They are a story, the most interesting story, or an interesting story from your life. So for me, this memoir, it's this 4-year span, and I hope that I, did a okay job conveying and making it interesting for people. And whoever asked that question, just stick with it and keep trying, and something great will come out.
Yeah, I think you did more than okay, Adam. So, folks, let's give Adam a big virtual round of applause for the job he's done tonight. Kathleen says this was very interesting and entertaining. Rosamond says fascinating program. Linda says this was fascinating. Thank you. Mary says thank you for the very interesting program. I can't wait to read the book. Nicole says, I missed most of it. Oh no, Nicole, but I enjoyed this last part. Will the recording be available? It absolutely will. You'll receive it. You'll all receive the recording via email tomorrow morning. Kay says thank you. My old friend Stephanie says thank you. Excellent. So Adam needs to put his children to bed. Robert needs to go upstairs to the reference desk. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. What a wonderful talk. Adam, you have any last words?
Just thanks so much for reading. If you haven't read it, it's out now. It's available in paperback and hardcover, audiobook. You said you listened on audiobook. That's my favorite way for people to consume the story, because it's me talking to you. It's like we're sitting in a long car ride and I just won't stop talking, So that's if you can stand the sound of my voice, audiobook is great too. So any of them are great. And thank you to all the libraries we partnered with for this event, and also Wellesley Books. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So folks, look for that email tomorrow with the link to the recording, link to the feedback survey, and a link to Wellesley Books. So thank you all and have a great night. Thanks again, Adam.
My pleasure.
Bye.
Take care.